Hello, my name is Stephen Seifers, and the issue that I'd like to address today is one of foreign policy. Now, we live in a post-Cold War era, an era where the United States has emerged as the dominant superpower of the world. However, the role of the United States has changed, and that is why I believe it is imperative that in order to adapt to this change, we as a nation must embrace a more multilateral approach to our foreign policy. In this way, we can assure greater involvement of the other world powers. Now, I will address the issue in a multitude of ways. First off, of how U.S. foreign policy stems from our practices in the early 20th century, as well as how we had a more unilateralistic approach during the Bush administration, and how it has in some ways continued into the Obama administration. And lastly, I would also like to address reforming the UN so as again to assure the greater involvement of the other world powers. Now, the first issue that I would like to address is how foreign policy of the early 20th century has influenced our views on foreign policy now. Specifically, I would like to look at the policy of President Theodore Roosevelt's administration. Now, President Roosevelt's Commission of the Great White Navy, which was a signal to the other world powers that America could act unilaterally should it need to. It could act without the influence of other nations. It could do it as was needed. And it has created this mindset in the American policymakers that American power is key, that it is what has made certain ventures most successful. Now, the next issue that I would like to address is how, because of the advent of the Cold War, America had no other choice but to be a multilateral nation, and how, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the nature of the U.S. has expanded it in such a way that it can be nothing other than unilateral without proper assessment of its abilities. Now, one of the greatest feats of any multilateral institution was the formation of the United Nations. And this was an achievement that had never been seen before, that was groundbreaking, that was made a promise of better international relations. You look at the military action in Greece, and you see the work of the various NATO nations against the Soviet bloc, and it was a very successful effort. You look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the U.S. now is placed in a position of really ultimate power. It is the only superpower remaining. The U.S. GNP, the gross national product, grew 27% following the decade of the collapse. That's almost twice that of the rest of the world, the other leading economies like Germany and Japan. That the U.S. has no other choice but to be unilateral in its approach. And that is the issue that we now face. Because when you look at the past 12 years, we have acted unilaterally, especially militarily. 2003, when we invaded Iraq, that was just us. There was no discussion about it, but there wasn't discussion in the UN other than Colin Powell coming out and providing the president's reasons for the invasion of Iraq. There was no discussion there, and this has continued, specifically with the war on terror, because when you look at it, President Bush has started the drone program, and President Obama has increased this. He has made it so that very little discussion goes into the process of making the decision to attack another country, because the defense is in the pursuit of ending the war on terror. And this is a very slippery slope that we find ourselves on. Now, before going over my own proposals for reform and increasing multilateralism, is this clip from C-SPAN of an interview with Bruce Jones, the former senior advisor to the Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan.
As far as reforms go, what would you advocate as number one as those reforms to make a UN a more effective body?
Well, I think the big reform out there that has to be tackled eventually is reform of the UN Security Council. The United States has a veto. It should and will continue to have a veto 2 European countries have a veto. I think there's a debate within Europe whether they're the right European countries. It's Britain and France. Russia has a veto, which maybe is a little bit anachronistic, but it's not going away. And China has a veto, which is a historical accident in a sense, but appropriate to the current circumstances. The question now is, how do you bring India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, these countries that make major contributions and play major roles in the UN, how do you bring them into the decision-making in the Security Council, to give them more of a voice, and then to take on more responsibility? This isn't just a question of gaining status, it's a question of taking on responsibility and being willing to pursue the objectives of the United Nations in their region.
And Mr. Jones hit the nail on the head, because what is imperative more than anything is a reform of the Security Council, of an expansion of the Security Council, because we need to assure that the nations that are demonstrating a greater power on the world stage have a greater role in the decision-making of the direction of international policy. And we as a nation should recognize this on an international scale by allowing the reform to happen and allowing them to, in turn, be involved. And aside from just this expansion of possibly permanent members, is an effort to democratize the non-permanent members. And by doing this, we allow for the smaller nations and the possibility to bring up a country whose interests line up with their own. Again, strengthening their own voice in the issue. And the other major reform that I would like to propose is one that deals with aggressive action and the UN's role with regards to it. Now, Morana Milanovic of Croatia, who presented a paper on the reform of the United Nations, we must balance it by this criteria. 1. The seriousness of the threat. 2. Proper purpose. 3. Last resort. 4. Proportional means. And 5. Balance of consequences. Now, had this approach been applied to Iraq, then we might not have seen ourselves in Iraq in the first place. We might have seen a more diplomatic approach. All I ask of you is to consider the options, to consider what I have presented to you, and make it so that as we move forward into the 21st century, we will not be doing it alone.